Hello, my name is Tom O'Carroll. You may have seen me at the Michigan Irish Music Festival. Sadly, not this year. None of us get to go. I would be there doing talks and singing a few songs about history and culture and the likes. And my wife, magician Debbie O'Carroll, can't be there either this year. So we're sad, but hopefully in 2021. Anyway, I'm here to talk a little bit about Irish royal families. Do you know we have, or had rather, high kings and queens and chieftains and all of that stuff? And very interesting in their background. They're, they have a certain mystique and a bit of magic, and there's always legend associated with them. In recent years, two kings were brought out of retirement to try to solve the country's problems. One was the king of Bulgaria, who was ousted in the 1940s. He showed up again after the Soviet Union collapsed, and as a private citizen had himself elected Prime Minister of Bulgaria. And another was when, if you remember, when the Taliban were kicked out of Afghanistan and they're trying to get all the people together, they brought out the king of Afghanistan, who was an elderly gentleman who had been deposed back in the 70s, and he was brought out of retirement. And the hope was that the mystique of the king and the legend behind it all and that whole power would somehow serve to unite the people. Perhaps it didn't work. It was a little bit beyond kingly powers to do so. But the interesting thing is that it was attempted as a symbolic act that this might help the nations. Anyway, our kings go back reliably to 200 BC, and they try to connect themselves to the sons of the King of Spain. This is kind of going back into legend and prehistory, who we're told came over around 500 BC. So the intervening 300 years between 200 BC and 500 BC, the genealogists had to make their chieftain, their king, connected to one of the sons. There was Heber, Heberon, and Ir, I think. And it was very important that your genealogist connected you to that. However, in later years, when Christianity came into play in the 5th century in Ireland, the genealogists got a little creative and took them all the way back to the sons of Noah. So genealogy being quite a science in many ways, and you get back and it gets very misty when you're going back over 200 years BC, but apparently authentic up to 200 BC, which means that Irish royals were in, the last High King of Ireland died in 1198. So we have had kings of Ireland definitely for 1400 years, and maybe a lot longer. We can't be sure. I'll concentrate on three of these kings that are interesting. You have the O'Neill, the O'Brien, and O'Connor Donn. The O'Neill is very ancient kings. They go back to before St. Patrick. In fact, Niall of the Nine Hostages, the man credited with capturing Patrick as a slave and bringing him to Ireland, he was the son of a king, and a king himself, and his father's name, wait for this one, spelled Eochaidh, pronounced Yucky. So King Yucky, who birthed Niall of the Nine Hostages. Niall of the Nine Hostages, by the way, was an adventurer and captured slaves as well, and travelled and had ships and the like. And he is responsible for about 8% of all Irish people living today. Their DNA, their mitochondrial DNA, contains Niall of the Nine Hostages imprimatur. In other words, he was quite the lad in his day. So that's the O'Neills. I have an interesting something to show you here. This is the inaugural stone of the O'Neills, and it's in the Ulster Museum. I don't know if you can see it closely or not. There we go, as best I can show you. It's made of sandstone, and they inaugurated their chieftains in a place called Tullyhogue. And this now is in the Ulster Museum. Kind of sad, really, that there was another one with the O'Donnells in Kilmacrenan in Donegal, where they inaugurated their chieftain. Their stone was smashed by Lord Mountjoy in the 1500s. Kind of a petty, vengeful act, but it had a great symbolic meaning to all the people in Donegal and all the O'Donnells. Another interesting chieftain is currently living today too, the O'Brien, a descendant of Brian Boru, who was an O'Brien, and they lived actually in Dromoland Castle, which is that fabulous castle just outside of Limerick. It's now a very expensive hotel. They lived there and owned it until 1962, when it was sold to an American hotel chain. I have never been there, never stayed there. It's a little beyond a folk singer's salary. However, I'm sure sometime I'd like to just maybe go in and have a drink in the bar and have a look at the portraits on the wall, see all the old O'Briens in their magnificent armour and so forth. And there's one other chieftain that's interesting too, O'Connor Donn, the first Christian king of Connacht, was an O'Connor, possibly baptized by St. Patrick himself. His name was Duach Galach, and his descendant was Rory O'Connor, the last High King of Ireland, who reigned from the 1150s into around 1170 or so, and then he retired and went to a monastery and died in 1198, and there was never been another High King of Ireland elected. So how do they elect a High King? Well, it's interesting. This is called the Deir Finne. There's 5 branches. You'd have the great-grandfather, grandfather, son, grandson, great-grandson. So if your great-granddaddy was a chieftain or a king, you were eligible to be chosen by the group to be the next king. In the 7th or 8th centuries, they changed this, and the kings and chieftains very often selected their successor, who was called Tanistry. And in Ireland, the vice prime minister, the prime minister is called a Taoiseach, which is Irish for chieftain, and the vice prime minister is called a Taoiseach, or the Tanist, the chosen one in the event that the Taoiseach can't be in power, or in interim power between governments or something like that. So we have the Taoiseach. They were inaugurated usually had a stone or something like that, and there was a little white wand associated. There was a ritual bathing. There was a horse, or sometimes a bull, that was ritually slaughtered and fed to the people attending the inauguration. The chieftain would step forward and turn around 3 times, very slowly and very ceremoniously in one direction, and then turn around in the other direction 3 times, just to survey his people and his kingdom. And it's all highly symbolic stuff. And whether or not you approve or disapprove of monarchies, it's interesting stuff, because it's all part of our history. Some of these chieftains were rapacious characters. There was one outside of Dublin who used to harass the city of Dublin, actually hold them to ransom, and he'd come in and shake them down for all kinds of money. And his name was Fiach McHugh O'Byrne. And Fiach McHugh, he had a good side to him as well. Young Hugh O'Donnell and his friend Art O'Neill had been taken prisoner by the English and imprisoned in Dublin Castle, and Fiach McHugh managed to spring them. It was on Christmas Eve in 1590 something or other, thereabouts. some of the dates are just around fairly accurate, that they sprung him, and it was very cold, and I think Art O'Neill maybe succumbed, died with the bad weather, and O'Donnell lost a couple of his toes, which is kind of interesting because recently they found what may be the burial place in Italy of the O'Donnell at the time, and his body would be identifiable by the fact that he's missing toes. So in the event they come up with the skeleton, that would be one way to identify him. Anyway, back to Fiach McHugh. He harassed the people of Dublin and with his band of men, and even beat the British in a battle in Glenamail. Oh, see the sword that Glenamail, flashing o'er the English pale, see all the children of the Gael beneath O'Byrne's banner. Rooster of a fighting stock, would you let a Saxon cock crow out upon an Irish rock? Why have been teaching manners? Curse and swear, Lord Kildare, Fiach will do what Fiach will dare. Lord Fitzwilliam, have a care, Paulin is her Starlow. Up with halberd, out with sword, on we go, for by the Lord, Fiach McHugh has given the word. Follow me up to Carlow. From Tissaggart to Clonmore flows a stream of Saxon gore, well great is Rory Ogomore, sending the looms to Haddie. White is sick and grey is the lead, now for Black Fitzwilliam's head, send it over ribbon red to Green Liza and her ladies. Curse and swear, Lord Kildare, Fiach will do what Fiach will dare. Lord Fitzwilliam, have a care, Paulin is her Starlow. Up with halberd, out with sword, on we go, for by the Lord, Fiach McHugh has given the word. Follow me up to Carlow. There we go with Fiach McHugh. Some of the interesting names of these chieftains were the McGillicuddy of the Reeks. The McGillicuddy Reeks are in County Kerry, and they hold Ireland's highest mountain, Carrantoul. And there's a gentleman from there whose official title is the McGillicuddy of the Reeks. It goes back into the ancient times. Another interesting one is there's a family, and their heritage is to be known as Shonach, or the Fox. He's a man now living in Australia. Doesn't really have much emotional attachment to this extraordinary title that he's entitled to. Another fella now, let me see who we got. Yes, I wanted to read this to you. This is from the Book of Leinster, and it goes back. The Book of Leinster came out, was produced in 1160. So that'd be before the Normans arrived in Ireland. That would be about 10 years before they came here. And this is advice from Cuchulainn to the High King of Ireland. And these are very, very, I don't know, they're very forward-looking in many ways. I'll read them out to you here. He says, do not provoke violence or strife. Do not be arrogant or aggressive. Let strangers in the land enter the protection of sanctuary. Do not deride or deceive the elderly. Do not participate in the oppression of others. Do not hoard things which are not needed. And finally, do not sacrifice human justice to passion. I think they're pretty decent laws to live by. I've got one more song for you, and I'm going to take up the drum for this one here. I'll shed the radar. You've seen these before. This one is from Michael Vignoles, terrific bodhrán maker and great piper from County Galway. I think he's from the Claddagh in County Galway, which is the old part of the city. This is called O'Donnell Aboo, after the chieftains, O'Donnells. They left Ireland in 1607. They had been beaten in a major battle, and in the Battle of Kinsale, which was 1601, and that was a terrible defeat for the Irish because when the O'Donnell and the O'Neill left Ireland for good, never to return. There's an O'Neill currently living in Portugal, so he would be a descendant of the O'Neill who left Ireland in 1607. There's as I say, there's another O'Neill living in Spain, who they're related to one another, and we have the descendant of Brian Boru still living. He would be the 32nd grandson of Brian Boru. And we have O'Connor Don, who's the descendant of Rory O'Connor, the last High King of Ireland. He's an English subject, he lives in England. Protestant, they changed their religion to fit. The O'Connor Don is Catholic, and they owned a place in County Roscommon called Clonallis that originally had a castle there, and now it's an 18th century house there, which is now owned by the state. And I believe you can visit every now and then. So there we have it. These would be the three official, if we had a throne, claimants to the Irish throne. The descendant of the last High King, O'Connor Don, being probably number one, I suppose, or the descendant of Brian Boru. Maybe he has a place in it at all. Brian Boru was a brilliant strategist, great military man, and actually really High King of all of Ireland. He was much admired, especially after routing the Vikings. Here we go I leave you with this one here, O'Donnell Abu, just a couple of verses for you. My wife's family are O'Donnells, so it's important that I include them here too. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed a few of the little stories here, and hope to see you in Michigan 2021. O'Donnell Abu. Loudly the note of the trumpet is sounding, loudly the war cries arise o'er the gale. Weakly the steed by Lochswilly is bounding to join the thick squadrons in Samar's green vale. On every mountaineer, stranger to flight and fear, flock to the standards of dauntless red hue. Bonnet and Gallo the last, throng from each mountain pass, on for old Ireland, O'Donnell Abu. Wildly o'er Desmond, the warwolf is howling, fleetly the eagle sweeps over the plain. The fox in the streets of the city is prowling, and all who would scare them are banished or slain. On with O'Donnell then, fight the old fight again, pay them all back the deep debt so long due. Make the proud Saxon feel Erin's avenging steel, strike for your country, O'Donnell Abu. Thank you, bye bye.